In that grand living room, my brother threw a $5 bill at my father's face, calling the heart surgery survivor a moocher even though Dad's savings built this entire estate. Dad stood still, his thin shoulders trembling under a flimsy hospital gown as he stared at that bill. But my brother had no idea I held the original, unrevoked power of attorney. Mark's cruelty has finally crossed a line. Thank you for being here with me tonight. To understand how it all fell apart, we have to go back to the start. After that $5 bill hit the floor, I realized this house had stopped being my parents' home long before today. It all started when the old lock stopped listening to me. I stood before the heavy oak door of the Malibu estate, holding the brass key Dad gave me 10 years ago when I first moved to Atlanta. But the lock was gone. In its place was a cold blue light, a fingerprint scanner my brother Mark had recently installed. I looked through the stained glass window and saw Mom in the marble kitchen. She didn't hear the bell, or maybe she had just learned to ignore it. The salt air of California filled my lungs, but from inside, I could still smell pine sol. That cheap floor cleaner she had used for 3 decades in our old suburban house was the only thing left proving she still existed in this place. Mom eventually opened the door with a faint smile, her eyes darting toward the stairs as if afraid Mark would catch me there. She handed me a cup of Maxwell House in a thin porcelain mug, the kind Mark always mocked as being too low class for his taste. She whispered that I shouldn't blame him, telling me he changed the locks because they were getting old and forgetful, and he was only trying to keep strangers out. I looked at the silver mailbox outside. The name Arthur Miller, P.E., was covered by a black plastic sign for Mark's investment firm. My father, the engineer who spent 40 years paying for every brick of this house, no longer even had a name on his own mailbox. Losing my place on that mailbox was just the beginning. Mark did not just want to own the walls of this house. He wanted to scrub away every trace of what he called our ordinary roots, the parts of our past that did not fit the image he was trying to sell to the world. Dad's study on the second floor used to be the most sacred room in the world to me. It was a space filled with the heavy, comforting smell of old paper and wood polish. I remember the stacks of technical notebooks from his years as an engineer at Boeing, their spines creased from decades of late-night study and hard work. But his real pride was that old leather-bound stamp collection he had started as a young man. On Sunday evenings, Dad would pull out a silver magnifying glass and lean over the desk, beckoning me to see a rare fragment from Europe or a delicate print from Japan. He always told me that those tiny slips of paper were the map of an honest man's life, a record of every mile he had traveled and every job he had done well. Now, that room is unrecognizable. Mark turned it into a modern bar, all cold glass and minimalist metal. The warm oak shelves were ripped out to make room for rows of expensive whiskey bottles used to impress his business associates. It is a sterile place now, echoing and empty, like the heart was cut out of the house to make room for something shiny and soulless. When I walked into that room today, Mark was standing by the fireplace with Dad's old album in his hands. He was casually ripping out the pages, tossing them into the roaring flames as if he were discarding junk mail. He told me he needed to clear the space for a new surround sound speaker system he had ordered. My father lunged forward, his legs still unsteady from his heart surgery, his hands reaching out to save those fragments of his history. Mark gave him a small shove, just a single movement of his arm, but it was enough to send Dad stumbling back onto the thick, expensive rug. Mark just looked down at him and told him that this garbage was only making the house look cheap. He told Dad it was time to learn how to live with class and stop clinging to things that no longer mattered. Dad did not yell or fight back. He just sat there on the floor, his thin, weathered fingers reaching toward the gray ashes floating in the air. He stared into the fire with a silence that was more terrifying than any scream I had ever heard. I stood frozen in the doorway, my own chest tight with a pain that felt like it was coming from the flames. To Mark, those stamps and technical drawings had no market value, so they were worthless. He could not understand that every one of those stamps represented a skipped breakfast in London, or an extra shift Dad worked in Seattle just to send money back home for Mark's college tuition. I looked at my father, the man who had always been a hero in my eyes, and saw someone small and discarded at the feet of the son he had sacrificed everything to raise. Mark's cruelty was not just about the physical things he was burning. It was a deliberate way to tear down the very last bit of dignity my father had left. Standing there, I realized that for my brother, our father was no longer a person. He was just a piece of old, inconvenient furniture that no longer fit the decor of his perfect life. But the peak of the humiliation did not happen with the stamps turning to ash in the fireplace. It happened at the dinner table that night, where Mark decided to show my father exactly how much he was worth in his eyes. The dining room in Malibu smelled like expensive lobster and chilled white wine. Mark and his wife, Jessica, sat at the center of the table, laughing under the crystal chandelier, while my father, the man who had only been out of heart surgery for 2 weeks, was pushed to the far end of the long table. He sat there with a bowl of canned soup he had heated up himself, a small, lonely figure in the shadow of his own success. When Dad reached into his pocket and pulled out a prescription the doctor said he needed urgently, Mark did not even stop chewing. He reached into his leather wallet, pulled out a crumpled $5 bill and tossed it across the table. The money hit Dad's cheek before floating down into his soup. Mark told him that his insurance was already costing a fortune and that he should just buy the cheap generic stuff from now on. He called my father a moocher and told him he needed to start saving for the sake of his grandchildren. Dad just sat there, his thin shoulders trembling under his hospital gown, staring at that bill soaking in his dinner. I watched my mother turn her face away, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the tablecloth to keep from crying. That $5 was probably less than Mark tipped the valet at lunch, but it felt like a knife in Dad's chest. Mark knew better than anyone that Dad had signed over his entire 401k and this very house to him 2 years ago, just to make managing the estate easier. Now Mark was using Dad's own life savings to show off his wealth, only to turn around and throw pennies at the man who actually earned it like he was some kind of saintly benefactor. I looked at the shame on my father's face, a face lined with 40 years of sacrifice for a son who now looked at him with nothing but contempt. I started to stand up, my blood boiling and ready to scream every truth I knew into Mark's face, but Dad caught my hand under the table. His skin was ice cold and covered in dark bruises from the IV needles at the hospital. He shook his head, a movement so small I almost missed it, but his eyes were begging me to stay quiet for the sake of peace. Mark went back to sipping his wine and talking to Jessica about their upcoming trip to Europe, completely ignoring the broken man sitting just a few feet away. I realized then that Mark did not just want the money, he wanted Dad to admit he was useless, to accept being a ghost in his own home. Mark thought he won that round, but he did not know I had seen his wallet sitting on the counter earlier, filled with credit cards still in my father's name. Maybe you are listening to this, and you can feel your own chest tightening with the same anger I felt. I think most of us who have spent our lives caring for our families recognize that look in my father's eyes, the look of a person who has become invisible in their own life. If you have ever felt like you were being treated like a burden by the people you raised, I want you to tell me your story in the comments. We cannot let this kind of silence win. Please like and subscribe so you do not miss the moment we finally demand justice for my father, because we are not going to keep quiet anymore. The morning mist over the Malibu coast usually feels like a fresh start, a clean slate washed in by the Pacific air. But that next day, the fog felt like a heavy, damp blanket trying to hide the wreckage left behind at the dinner table. I walked out onto the porch, my chest still tight from watching my father stare at that $5 bill in his soup, only to find myself watching a masterclass in a different kind of cruelty. The sun was just starting to burn through the gray when the familiar rumble of the mail truck sounded at the end of the driveway. I saw my brother Mark walk down the stone path, his posture straight and his face lit with the most radiant, genuine smile I had ever seen him wear. He looked like the golden son of every mother's dream. He greeted Jim, the mailman who had been serving this neighborhood for over a decade, with a firm, friendly handshake. Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out a $50 bill, handing it to Jim with a casual grace that made it look like a spontaneous act of kindness. He spoke loudly enough for his voice to carry back to the porch, telling Jim that tomorrow was our mother's birthday and asking him to make sure the local florist delivered the absolute best bouquet they had. He told Jim that he just wanted his parents to be as happy as possible in these final years of their lives. Jim was clearly moved, patting Mark on the shoulder and calling him the most devoted son on this stretch of the coast. I stood hidden behind the tall rose bushes, feeling a wave of nausea rise in my throat as I remembered the cold, sharp edge of that $5 bill he had thrown at Dad's face less than 12 hours before. Mark was buying a reputation with pocket change, building a pedestal for himself while he drained the lifeblood of his own family behind those marble walls. He understood the culture of Malibu perfectly. This was a place where people judged your success by how generously you tipped and how loudly you spoke about your charitable heart. To Jim and the neighbors, Mark was a saint, a busy executive who still made time to personally oversee the comfort of his aging, fragile parents. But I knew the truth. I knew that the moment Jim's truck disappeared around the bend, that bright smile would vanish, replaced by the same sneer of contempt he reserved for anyone who could no longer serve his ambition. He was not being a good son. He was making a strategic investment in his public image, using our parents as props in a performance designed to help him climb the next rung of his social ladder. Every polite nod and every generous tip was just a brick in the wall he was building to keep the world from seeing the cold, empty space where his heart should have been. I waited until Mark went back inside the house before I stepped out from the shadows to meet Jim. The old mail carrier looked up at me, his eyes kind and familiar. He told me it was good to see me home and asked how my father was doing. He mentioned that Mark had told everyone Dad was resting in the basement for some quiet time because the noise of the main house was too much for his recovering heart. I looked into Jim's honest, weathered face and felt my own heart break all over again. Mark had spun such a perfect story, turning the act of locking our parents in a dark, damp basement into a gesture of special care and consideration. In this world of multi-million-dollar estates and perfectly manicured lawns, the truth was being buried under layers of polite lies and generous tips. People like Jim saw what they were told to see, and Mark was a master at telling people exactly what they wanted to believe about a successful man and his aging father. Jim reached into his bag and pulled out a small, pale blue envelope that looked a bit worn around the edges. He told me it was addressed to Arthur Miller and had come from an old friend at Boeing. He said that Mark had told him to just let the office handle all the mail, but Jim felt like I should be the one to give it directly to Dad. He handed me the letter, and for a moment, I could feel the warmth of genuine human connection through the paper. Jim looked at me, his voice dropping to a low, steady whisper. He told me he had worked this route for a long time and that he knew the difference between the smell of real kindness and the smell of a performance. He told me to take good care of my parents, and his words felt like a bucket of cold water waking me up from a nightmare. There were people out there who saw the cracks in Mark's mask, and Jim was the first light I had found in the suffocating darkness of this house. I tucked the letter deep into my pocket, feeling a new kind of strength begin to stir inside me. Mark could deceive the rest of the world with his money and his fake smiles, but he could not fool people like Jim, the quiet observers who understood that a person's real value was not found in what they gave away for show, but in how they treated the people who had nothing left to give them. That letter from Dad's old friend at Boeing felt like a heavy weight in my pocket, a key to a past that Mark was so desperate to burn away. I looked up at the small, high window of the basement where my father was sitting in the shadows, and I made a silent promise to him right then. Jim was not going to be my only ally, and this morning was the last time Mark would get to play the hero while my father was treated like a ghost. After holding that pale blue letter from Jim, the stranger who had shown more kindness than my own brother, I made my way down to the basement. I realized then that the truth rarely lives under the bright glow of crystal chandeliers in the grand living rooms of Malibu. Instead, it hides in the cold, forgotten corners where no one else bothers to look. The basement of the mansion was a damp, narrow space that always smelled faintly of wet concrete, old cardboard boxes, and settled dust. Mark had made it a rule to cut the power down there every night at 7, claiming he was just being efficient with the bills, while he left our parents to navigate the dark on their own. As I stepped down the creaking wooden stairs, the only light I saw was a tiny, flickering beam from a handheld flashlight. Dad was sitting in that old, worn-out armchair my mother had insisted on bringing from their suburban house. He was hunched over, his eyes following the lines of a newspaper Jim must have slipped him earlier in the week. The room was freezing, and the air felt heavy, but as I got closer, I caught the sharp, clean scent of pine sol. It was the smell of my mother's hands, a scent of home that felt so out of place against the sterile, hollow luxury of the floors above us. It was a humble smell, but in that basement, it was the only thing that felt real. I sat down beside him on the cold floor and handed over the letter. Dad's hands, still covered in the dark purple bruises from the hospital needles, trembled as he pulled the thin paper from the envelope. It was an invitation from the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, a formal request for him to attend a gala honoring the pioneers of the Boeing 747 project. I watched him stare at the words, Chief Engineer Arthur Miller, for a long time, his gaze moving back and forth between the elegant print and his own calloused, shaking fingers. He did not say a word, but I could see his chest rising and falling rapidly under the thin fabric of his hospital gown. Mom stepped out from the shadows near the back of the room and draped a worn wool blanket over his shoulders. She looked at me then, and the fear I had seen in her eyes upstairs was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. Dad finally looked up, his voice raspy but clearer than it had been in weeks. He told me that they still called him an engineer, Sarah. He said they did not see him as a piece of waste to be discarded. Looking at him in that moment, I understood that Mark could take the house. He could cut the lights, and he could throw all the $5 bills he wanted, but he had not touched the steel core of the man my father was. That recognition from his old colleagues had lit a fire in him that I thought had been snuffed out during his surgery. I realized that a person's dignity does not belong to a $1 million mansion. It belongs to the truth of who they are and what they have given to the world. I felt a surge of energy move through me, a fierce need to protect that small flame at any cost. I was not going to stand by and watch my brother trample over their lives anymore. That night, in the damp darkness of that basement, the three of us found a connection that no fingerprint lock or electronic security system could ever hope to break. But simply reading that invitation under the dim beam of a flashlight was not going to be enough. I knew my father needed more than just a silent memory of who he used to be. He needed to be heard, and he needed to belong to a community where his name still carried the weight it deserved. He needed to know that his mind was still a bridge to the rest of the world. I quietly brought him a new iPad the next day, setting it up with a private 5G hotspot so Mark would have no way of tracking his data or seeing his screen on the house network. I sat with him on that old armchair and showed him how to log into a professional discussion group for retired Boeing engineers. That afternoon, while the muffled sounds of a cocktail party and the shallow clinking of glasses drifted down from the pool deck above, my father put on a pair of noise-canceling headphones and began to speak. At first, his voice was thin and hesitant, like he was afraid the air itself would reject his words. But within minutes, the language of his life, the talk of technical schematics and aerodynamic pressures, began to flow out of him with a sudden, sharp clarity. I stood by the basement door, watching him, as his voice grew steady and commanding. He was telling a group of younger engineers in Seattle that a specific engine failure they were discussing was rooted in the hydraulic systems, not the fuel lines. On the other end of that digital connection, men he had never met were calling him Professor Miller, with a tone of deep, genuine respect. Watching him in that moment, it felt like my father had aged backward 10 years in a single afternoon. His back was no longer hunched against the cold of the basement, and his eyes were bright and focused behind his reading glasses. Mark had made a massive mistake when he thought that cutting off Dad's physical world would cause his mind to crumble. He did not understand the enduring strength of a brain that had spent 40 years solving the most complex problems of human flight. I felt a surge of pride that nearly choked me, but alongside it was a cold, hard anger at my brother. I wondered how a son could look at a man this brilliant and see only a burden to be managed. Mark was a man who spent his life trading in virtual numbers and hollow status symbols, but my father was the man who had built the machines that actually touched the sky. Confidence was returning to Dad, and that was a type of strength Mark never saw coming because he did not believe it existed in the people he had already decided were obsolete. The basement was no longer just a room full of old boxes. It had become a command center, and for the first time since his surgery, my father was finally back in the pilot seat. But Mark is a narcissist, and he has an incredibly sharp intuition for even the smallest hint of resistance. When he noticed that my father was no longer walking with his head bowed in quiet defeat, he knew he had to tighten the chains. He could feel the shift in the air, a newfound steadiness in Dad's gaze that made him deeply uncomfortable. For a man like Mark, a father who finds his dignity again is a direct threat to his absolute control. Mark suddenly decided to host a lavish tea party in the estate's garden, inviting the wealthiest and most influential neighbors in Malibu to showcase the perfect life he had built. He forced my mother into a stiff floral dress he had bought for her, a garment Mom whispered was far too tight and made it hard for her to breathe. In front of the gathered crowd, Mark led her to a chair with his arm draped tightly around her shoulders, his voice booming with practiced warmth as he addressed the guests. He told everyone that his parents' health was failing rapidly, and that their memories were becoming so clouded he had to bring them here just to ensure they were fed and cared for properly. He turned to Dad with a thin, cold smile and asked him if he had forgotten his morning pills again, mocking him for constantly mumbling about his old engineering drawings. The neighbors all sighed in admiration, calling Mark the most devoted son they had ever met, while my father stood there frozen, his lips pressed tight to keep a wave of fury from breaking out. I stood in the shadows of the porch, my heart aching as I watched my parents being used as nothing more than props for Mark's performance. He was using the ultimate shield of failing memory to strip away their autonomy in front of the entire community. It was a sophisticated kind of cruelty. Mark knew that if he played the part of the long-suffering son dealing with Alzheimer's, no one would ever believe my parents if they tried to call for help. He was weaving a web of lies around them, turning my father's sharp mind into a mere symptom of confusion. I looked at that bright floral dress on my mother, and to me, it looked like a prison uniform decorated with lace. Mark's version of filial piety was a poison wrapped in sugar, and I could see my mother trembling with the sheer humiliation of being treated like a helpless child. When one of the neighbors stepped forward to ask Dad about his long career at Boeing, Mark immediately cut him off with a condescending laugh. He told the man that Dad only really remembered things from the mid-century era now, and that they shouldn't tire him out with complicated talk. He chuckled and led the neighbor away to the bar, leaving my father standing alone and abandoned in the middle of a crowd of strangers who now looked at him with pity. Dad looked at me, and his eyes held a cold, desperate urgency. He was no longer the submissive father I had seen a week ago. He reached out and lightly touched the pocket of his jacket where he kept the iPad I had given him, a small gesture to remind me that he still held the truth. Mark was still basking in the praise of his guests, but he had no idea that his mask was already starting to crack from the inside. Have you ever felt that knot of pure indignation in your chest when you see a successful child use the word care as an excuse to silence their own parents? It is a special kind of pain to watch a brilliant mind be slandered by the very person they raised and loved. If you have ever witnessed this kind of manipulation, or felt the sting of being talked over because of your age, please tell me your story in the comments. You are not alone in this, and the truth deserves to be heard. Please like and subscribe to stand with Sarah as she prepares to bring this entire kingdom of lies crashing down in the next chapter. But the artificial peace of the tea party did not last long, As soon as the last neighbor had driven away, Mark's fake smile vanished, and the silence that followed was heavy with a new kind of danger. He had noticed the change in Dad, and it did not take him long to find the source of what he called our betrayal. Mark charged into the basement like a wild animal. He began rummaging through my parents' few remaining possessions, tossing their old books and worn blankets across the cold floor in a frantic search. He finally found it, ripping the iPad out from where Dad had hidden it under his mattress. He threw the device onto the stone floor, the sound of the glass shattering echoing like a gunshot in the cramped space. He lunged forward and grabbed my father by the collar, the same father who had undergone heart surgery less than a month ago. Mark screamed in Dad's face, demanding to know if he really intended to use that toy to humiliate him in front of his old colleagues. When my mother tried to step between them, Mark shoved her aside with a force that sent her stumbling into a stack of old boxes. She hit the floor hard, a small gasp of pain escaping her lips. Mark then reached for Dad's wallet, pulling out his Medicare card and his credit card. He snapped the plastic in half right in front of Dad's eyes. He told him there would be no more doctors or medication from now on. He told my father that if he was still such a brilliant engineer, he should find a way to fix his own failing heart. I ran down the stairs and stood frozen, my breath catching as I looked at the wreckage. My blood felt like it was turning to fire. Seeing my father standing there, his legs shaking and his breath coming in shallow gasps from the shock, and seeing my mother on the floor with tears in her eyes, something inside me finally snapped. Mark was no longer my brother. He was a monster fueled by a greed I could no longer recognize as human. He had crossed the final line. This was no longer just about words. It was a deliberate attempt to destroy them. I looked into Mark's eyes and saw a terrifying emptiness. He truly believed he had the right to do this because he owned the house. In that moment, my fear disappeared. It was replaced by a steely resolve. Mark had made his move, but he had no idea that I was finally ready to make him pay for it. After the storm of Mark's rage finally passed, the basement fell into a silence so profound it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Amidst the jagged shards of the iPad and the broken pieces of my father's medical cards, my mother reached out and took his hand. Her grip was firm, a silent anchor in the dark. She did not look at the ruins of their belongings or the shattered glass on the floor. Instead, she began to talk, her voice a soft, steady thread pulling us back to a time that felt a lifetime away from the cold marble floors and the cruelty of the world above us. She spoke of the winter of 1975 in Seattle, back when they were newlyweds living in a studio apartment so small they had to fold the bed into the wall just to have enough room to eat. Dad was a young engineer then, a man who spent his nights hunched over a drafting table he had salvaged from a neighbor's curb. He would stay up until the gray Pacific sunrise, sketching out the intricate curves of airplane wings while the heater hissed and rattled in the corner. Mom told me how they used to split a single loaf of sourdough bread for 3 days straight, all so they could set aside enough money for the expensive technical manuals Dad needed to advance his career. She reminded him that he never once considered quitting, even when his supervisors told him his ideas were too ambitious for a man of his age. I watched my father as she spoke. He had his eyes closed, drifting back to a version of himself that had not yet been wounded by his own flesh and blood. That kind of grit, that quiet dignity born from genuine struggle, was something Mark could never comprehend. Mark was a child of the abundance they had worked so hard to provide, and because he had never known the weight of a truly hard day, he mistook their humility for weakness. He thought their value was tied to the house, but he did not realize that their strength was forged in the years they spent building a world out of nothing but hope. The moonlight began to filter through the high, dusty window of the basement, casting a long silver beam across my parents' faces. In that pale light, the lines of exhaustion seemed to soften, and I saw the people they truly were. Mark could destroy every physical possession they owned, but he could never touch the spirit they had built together. They were part of a generation that understood that pride is not something you buy with a paycheck. It is something you earn with your integrity. Mom reached into an old cardboard box and pulled out a yellowed photograph. It was a picture of Dad standing on the tarmac next to the first Boeing jet he had helped design, his face glowing with a pride that was entirely earned. Dad opened his eyes and looked at that photo. Then he looked at me. His hands finally went still. The shame my brother had tried to shove down his throat seemed to evaporate in the face of that memory. He sat up a little straighter, his voice regaining the calm authority of a man who knew his own worth. He looked at my mother and said, "I am still that man, Patricia, and I am not going to let him destroy what we built." After Mark snapped my father's Medicare card in half, he truly believed he had stripped the old man of his final defense. He thought he had won because he held the physical keys to the house and the legal power over their health. But his arrogance made him careless. He forgot that I have spent the last 15 years of my life as a project manager, a job that requires me to track every cent, spot every red flag, and find the truth hidden in the fine print of a 1,000-page contract. His act of violence downstairs did not break us. It gave me the cold, clear focus I needed to do what I should have done the moment I stepped back into this house. While Mark was upstairs celebrating his supposed victory with a glass of expensive scotch, I slipped into his home office. I did not have to look far. I found an external hard drive tucked away in a locked drawer that I opened using the spare key Mom had hidden in a kitchen jar years ago. My hands were steady as I scrolled through his digital files, and what I found made the air in the room feel like ice. It was not just about him managing the estate anymore. Mark had secretly transferred the deed of the Malibu house to a shell company in the Cayman Islands over 6 months ago. But the real betrayal was buried in the healthcare power of attorney my parents had signed when Dad first went in for his heart surgery. Mark had swapped the final signature page, turning a document meant to protect their medical rights into an unconditional gift deed for every asset they owned. In the eyes of the law, the people who had worked 2 jobs for 40 years to pay off this mortgage were now legally homeless in their own living room. I leaned against his mahogany desk, a wave of nausea washing over me as I stared at the cold, legal language on the screen. Mark was not just an ungrateful son. He was a financial predator who had spent months calculating exactly how to erase our parents from their own legacy. He had waited for the precise moment when Dad was at his weakest and Mom was paralyzed by fear to trick them into signing their lives away. This was not a family disagreement. It was a corporate-style robbery executed under the guise of love. I thought of my father sitting in that dark basement, turning off the lights to save a few pennies on the electric bill, while his own son was using this very house as collateral for reckless offshore speculations. Mark's greed had finally swallowed the last drop of human decency he had left, leaving nothing but a hollow shell of a man who viewed his own parents as liabilities. I moved quickly to copy every single file onto a small USB drive I kept in my pocket. As the progress bar crawled across the screen, I found one last document that made my blood boil. Mark was acting as the secret representative for a private equity fund that wanted to acquire this coastal land to flatten the house and build a luxury hotel complex. In his project notes, under a section labeled "Obstacles to be Removed," he had listed my mother and father by name. He had already scouted a low-cost, unlicensed nursing home in a remote part of the desert to dump them once the final permits were signed. I looked at the framed family photo on his desk, the one where he is smiling between them on their wedding anniversary, and I felt a level of disgust I did not know was possible. He had been planning to sell their memories to the highest bidder all along. I tucked the USB drive into my pocket, feeling a surge of steely strength. Mark thought his game was over, but the real play was only just beginning. I think there is a specific kind of chill that settles in your bones when you realize the person you raised has turned your trust into a tool for betrayal. It is a terrifying thought that the people who share our blood can sometimes be the most dangerous strangers in the room. If you are listening to this and you can feel your heart racing, I want you to know that you are not alone. Have you ever discovered a financial betrayal like this in your own family? Have you ever felt that sudden, sickening shock of realizing someone you loved was stealing your future while you were looking the other way? Please, tell me your story in the comments because we cannot let these things stay hidden in the shadows. If you want to stand with me and make sure my father gets his justice, please like and subscribe. I am not going to let my brother win this, and I need you with me for what comes next. I confronted Mark right there in the living room, in the middle of all that hollow luxury he had bought with money that was never truly his. I threw the Cayman files onto the glass coffee table, the sound of the paper hitting the surface echoing through the house like a gavel. I expected him to flinch, to deny it, or to at least look ashamed. But the mask did not just crack. It fell away entirely, revealing something dark and unrecognizable beneath. Mark did not look afraid at all. He started to laugh, a dry, frantic sound that chilled my blood as he stood up to face me. He did not deny a single thing. Instead, he began to shout, his voice echoing off the marble walls as he admitted he hated the way we grew up. He screamed about the mediocre middle-class life our parents had provided, mocking the way Mom used to clip coupons from the Sunday paper and the fact that he had to attend a public school. He told me he had spent 30 years clawing his way up to Malibu, while all our parents had to do was get old to feel entitled to sit in this house. Then he said the most terrible thing of all. He leaned in and admitted he had already bought the very cemetery plots where they intended to be buried, just so he could pave them over for a parking lot for his new hotel. He told us he wanted to erase every trace of their existence. He threw his wineglass onto the floor, and the expensive crystal shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, mirroring the final ugly break in our family. I looked over and saw my parents standing by the hallway door. They had heard every word, every ounce of venom that had spilled out of their firstborn son. In that moment of absolute coldness, I remembered a quote by Maya Angelou that my mother used to read to me when I was a little girl. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. We had spent decades trying to see a goodness in Mark that was never there, trying to justify his greed as ambition. I turned to my father and took his trembling hand in mine, feeling the thinness of his skin. I whispered to him that he was not mediocre. I told him that while Mark was busy building a prison out of lies and stolen assets, Dad was the man who had built the massive machines that carried people into the sky. I told him that his dignity did not depend on a piece of dirt in a graveyard or the deed to a mansion in Malibu. For the first time since his surgery, I saw my father pull his shoulders back. He stood up straight, his back no longer hunched under the weight of his son's contempt. The pain of being betrayed by his own blood was still there, but it was being replaced by the steady, focused resolve of an engineer looking at a failed design. He was no longer a victim. He was a man reclaiming his soul from the wreckage of his son's ego. The truth was far more bitter than I ever could have imagined. Mark did not actually love the wealth of this coast. He just hated the roots that reminded him of where he came from. He viewed my parents' 40 years of honest sacrifice as a stain on his image because it reminded him of a beginning that was not glamorous enough for his new friends. I realized then that no matter how much you give, some people will only ever see your love as a resource to be harvested. When Mark admitted to buying those burial plots just to pave them over, he finally cut the last thread that connected him to our family or even to his own humanity. My father looked at his son not with anger, but with the quiet, heavy disappointment of a creator looking at a blueprint that had gone horribly wrong. There was nothing left to say to the man Mark had become. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout or insult. We were finally done with his lies, and for the first time in years, we were ready to walk out of that house and leave the ghost of his greed behind us. Mark truly believed he had won because he held a stack of forged documents and a title deed in his hand. He was so blinded by his own arrogance that he forgot that here in America, the law and the truth always have silent allies that people like him usually choose to overlook. He thought his wealth made him untouchable, but he never realized that the very people he looked down upon were the ones holding the evidence that would bring his world down. The high-pitched wail of police sirens suddenly tore through the quiet evening air of Malibu, shattering the silence of the estate. I had called the authorities and the lawyers from the Engineering Association the moment I stepped away with the files I found on that USB drive. Mark was handcuffed right there on the expensive red carpet in his grand living room, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as the officers read him his rights. But the hardest blow for him was not the cold steel of the handcuffs. It was the footage from the hidden camera I had installed in the basement, showing the exact moment he had brutally shoved our mother and snapped my father's Medicare card in two. To make matters worse, the medical report I requested from the hospital revealed he had been slipping low-dose sedatives into their tea for weeks to keep them in a state of constant, manageable confusion. As the reality of his situation set in, Mark began to sob, clutching at the hem of my mother's floral dress and begging her for help, calling her his dear mother, a title he had discarded the moment he thought he no longer needed her. I watched the scene unfold and felt a strange, profound sense of relief wash over me. Justice was not just about seeing Mark taken away in the back of a patrol car. It was about seeing my parents finally being recognized for their true value and their inherent dignity after months of being treated like ghosts. Mark started screaming at them as he was being led away, claiming they couldn't just abandon him because they owed him the success, but my father stepped forward. He was not shouting or looking for a fight. He looked at my brother with the iron calm of a man who had faced the most dangerous mechanical failures in the sky and survived with his honor intact. He told Mark that he no longer owed him anything. The debt of love and sacrifice had been paid in full by Mark's own cruelty and greed. The most satisfying part of that entire night was watching my father stand tall on his own 2 feet, refusing to use his cane for support, and needing no one's permission to be exactly who he was. My mother walked over to where Mark was standing between the officers. She did not cry, and she did not look away. She reached out with a steady hand and quietly took back the heavy ring of electronic keys from his fingers, reclaiming the control he had stolen from them. She looked directly into the eyes of the son she had spent a lifetime raising and protecting. She told him that she had spent 30 years trying to teach him how to be a successful man, but she realized now that she had completely forgotten to teach him how to be a human being. She told him clearly that her sacrifice ended today, and that she was finally closing the door on his entitlement. Mark was led out of the house, his long shadow stretching across the cold marble floor as he disappeared into the night. The Malibu mansion finally felt like a home again, not a trap or a prison meant to hide away the elderly. I saw my parents take each other's hands, and for the first time in years, they shared a genuine, peaceful smile as they looked out at the brilliant California sunset over the ocean. The waves of Malibu continue to crash against the shore just as they have for millions of years. Mark is gone now, and the house has finally grown quiet, but the scars on my parents' hearts remain as a constant reminder of the price of blind sacrifice. They made the decision to sell the estate almost immediately. They had no desire to live in a gilded tomb filled with the memories of such a deep betrayal. They bought a small, modest house near the library where my mother takes her morning walks, and my father has a sunlit room to consult for young engineers who still value his brilliant mind. I realize now that the greatest legacy is not money or real estate. It is dignity. Mark lost because he believed money could buy a meaningful existence. My parents won because they stepped out of the silence to protect themselves. This new house is small, but it holds a freedom that Malibu never could. This afternoon I sat on the porch with them sharing a pot of Maxwell House coffee. It is the same brand Mark used to call trash, but to us it tastes like peace. We do not talk about him much anymore. Instead, we talk about the future and the trips they have always dreamed about. I noticed my father still keeps that crumpled $5 bill in his wallet. He does not keep it to spend. He keeps it as a reminder of the threshold of humiliation he crossed and the strength it took to finally stand up. Malibu sparkles in the distance, but true happiness is right here in the sound of my mother's soft laughter as she reads. I tell this story so we can understand that sacrifice should never become food for someone else's greed. A parent sacrifice is priceless, but without clear boundaries, it can accidentally feed a child ingratitude. Never stay silent in the face of mistreatment, even if it comes from your own blood. To the parents listening tonight, please know that you are not a burden. Your wrinkles are the proof of a life well lived. You deserve respect in the home you built. Speak up before it is too late, because your dignity is the greatest legacy you will ever leave.